Okay, good morning, class. Today we are starting off with that chapter 6. Yesterday we went over our key terms for our new chapter. Let's see how well we remember some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. Who can tell us about Westward Expansion? Who remembers what was that Westward Expansion, Sam?
Movement from someplace in the east, United States to west, or Midwest.
Yeah, so it's moving from the eastern United States, where those first 13 original colonies were. It's moving across the United States, so going westward. Makes sense. So they're going into the Midwest, where Minnesota is, and going all the way out west to California. Treaty, Peyton.
A written agreement between two or more nations.
That's a written agreement. It's not just an alliance where you say, hey, let's partner up. This is a written one, so it's more formal between two or more nations. What does it mean to ratify something, Paul? Yeah, to approve it formally. It's not just one person saying, yep, this is what we need to do. It's something that's approved by the leaders. It's a formal approval. What is a territory? Ryan?
A territory is a part of the United States that is not within a state, but is organized with its own governing leaders.
Yeah, so it's a part of the United States, but it's not actually in a state. So think about when we talked about the first 13 original colonies became the first 13 states, and then we had all that land. Those became territories before they were states. We still have territories of the United States today, even though all of the United States is covered by states. Now we have some islands that are the territories for us. Annuity. What does annuity mean, Colin?
Annual payment of food and money that the U.S. government pays the American
Yeah, so it's that annual payment. So annual means once a year. Every year they pay food and money. In return, they get the land. So the government is paying out food and money to the American Indians, but they get their land. So that means the American Indians aren't living where they normally lived. Now they have to live on a reservation. What is a reservation, Gabby? Yeah, it's a special piece of land that's reserved by the government just for the Native Americans, the American Indians. So the American Indians didn't get to pick where that land was. The American government did. And they said, this is where you're going to live, and we're going to give you food and money for you to live there so we can have all the rest of the land. What is a debt, Ryan?
A debt is something that is owned, such as money, goods, or services.
Yeah, a debt is anything that's owed. Could be money, could be goods, could be services, something that you owe to someone else. And the last one, assimilation. What is assimilation, Paul?
Getting used to a larger group's values or things that they do.
Yeah, it's not even just getting used to it, it's adopting it, doing it yourself. So it's adopting the values and habits of the larger group. So yesterday in the other class, somebody had brought up, well, why didn't the American Indians just live in the houses with the settlers? Why did they have to give up their land and go to a reservation? They could have just lived in a house. That would be assimilating to the white settlers' lifestyle, to their culture. A lot of times when people are in new cultures, they don't want to give up who they are. They don't want to stop being who they are, give up their culture and change. They want to hold on to some of their culture. So a lot of times immigrants come over to the United States and they assimilate to some degree, but a lot of times they hold on to their culture. Mr. Gambino's dad came over from Italy. And he lives like most Americans, but he holds on to some of his Italian culture because he doesn't want to lose where he came from. So a lot of times when there's assimilation, people have to lose what they've had. So they only assimilate somewhat and they hold on to some of what they have. So if you go to like in Chicago, they have Little Italy. It's a neighborhood in Chicago where a lot of Italians live, and they really hold on to that Italian culture. And so when you go there, you almost feel like you're back in Italy. So it's like that for a lot of different countries. When the immigrants come here and there's a large group of immigrants living together, they can hold on to that culture. They can make it kind of seem like home where they came from. But when it's just a couple of people from one culture living amongst all these people that live differently, it's hard to hold on to that. So you take on more of the culture that you're living in. The American Indians had lived their lifestyle, lived their culture for thousands of years, for centuries. So it's a big deal to say, oh, just change, just be different, because that's not who they were. So we'll see how there's this conflict between, do we assimilate and become like the white settlers, or do we hold on to who we are? Do we hold on to those values that have been so important to us for thousands of years? So I'm excited for this chapter. We're gonna really get into some good stuff. Let's start off on page 99, chapter 6, page 99. The land changes hands. The United States was a young nation that was growing quickly and desired more land. During the mid-1800s, it acquired millions of acres of land from Minnesota's Dakota and Ojibwe. Land changed hands through a series of written agreements called treaties. Learn how life was changing in dramatic ways for those connected to the land. For nearly 150 years, European fur traders and travelers had come and gone from the land we now call Minnesota. Most of them were not interested in changing the ways of the Dakota and Ojibwe or in owning the land. The traders and their employers, the big fur trading companies from France and Great Britain, were mainly concerned with making a profit. They didn't care about owning the land. They didn't care about the lifestyle of the American Indians. They just wanted to make money. Fur trading companies, though, were not the only ones to see North America as a source of profit. In addition to animal furs, North America was also full of other natural resources. Timber, tobacco, and food were valuable back in Europe as well. At different times in the 1700s, France, Britain, and Spain had all claimed they owned these natural resources and controlled trade with the American Indians. Sometimes European countries fought wars over who would control North America. Other times they made agreements to sell their claim over a section of land to another country. These arguments over who controlled North America affected American Indian nations such as the Ojibwe and Dakota. At first, they traded with the French, then the British. Beginning in the early 1800s, they were no longer trading with Europeans. They now were dealing with a new nation, the United States, whose citizens were called Americans. Since their families had mostly come from Europe, they were European Americans. Because a lot of these settlers are immigrants coming over from Europe. So instead of doing that trading with the people actually in Europe, now they're just trading with the Americans. So the American Indians and the citizens of the United States are now trading together. A new nation grows. In 1783, the United States won independence from Great Britain in the Revolutionary War. Soon after, the new nation looked to expand or grow to the west. If we're only on the East Coast, that's the only direction they had to grow. They wanted to push out to the west because that's where the land was. As a result of winning the war, the United States claimed control of land previously claimed by Great Britain. This included much of the land between the original 13 colonies and the Mississippi River. Britain controlled much of Canada, and France and Spain still claimed ownership of land in Florida and west of the Mississippi River. In reality, however, this land belonged to the hundreds of American Indian nations that had lived there for centuries. If the United States wanted to expand, it would have to acquire land from those American Indian nations. So it's not that the land was empty and it was just up for grabs. We know that the American Indians have been living here. We know about the Dakota and the Ojibwe here in Minnesota. They've been here for centuries. So now the United States wants the land. They have to work out agreements to get that land. In the early 1800s, thousands of European American settlers were so eager to go west that they moved onto lands still belonging to American Indian nations. The U.S. government supported this westward expansion by acquiring land from these groups. Sometimes the United States made written agreements called treaties with American Indian nations to buy land for cash and goods. The making of treaties was, and still is today, familiar practice between sovereign, self-ruling nations. The treaties between American Indian nations and the United States were complicated. However, because the balance of power was not equal, both sides knew that the United States was more powerful. They had more technology, they had more people, more soldiers. It had more money, more people, and more military power than individual American Indian nations. As a result, most treaties favored the U.S. government at the expense of the American Indian nations. So, what I talked about yesterday with those reservations, the United States reserved pieces of land for the American Indians to move onto, but it wasn't the good pieces. The treaty favored the United States. They said, oh, this is land we don't want. We're keeping the good land for ourselves and we're giving you what we don't want. So they were able to make these treaties that favored them. So it wasn't equal, it wasn't balanced. Several times, rather than accept an unfair deal, American Indians chose to fight for their land. The United States responded by using its power to force them to sign agreements anyway. The United States did not always live up to the commitments it made in these legal agreements. So, yesterday it came up, I think, in the other class. They were talking about um, a lot of the settlers had this fear of the American Indians. And so, they had been watching Little House on the Prairie. And they saw that the fear that people on the TV show had, based in reality, that the settlers were scared of the American Indians. And it was kind of justified in one way because some American Indians were fighting back. They were saying, no, this is our land. We want to keep our land. We want to keep our culture. We want to stay how things have been for centuries. So they were fighting back. So some settlers were afraid because they didn't know if the American Indians were going to attack them. Is it justified what the American Indians were doing? Sometimes. Sometimes they attacked innocent people who didn't deserve it. Sometimes they were attacking people for a just cause to protect their land. So it kind of went both ways. So some of what the American Indians were doing made sense. They were protecting themselves. They weren't savages, and a lot of settlers saw them as savages. They weren't. We have to see things from each of their perspectives. So some of the settlers were justified in being scared because they didn't know what was going to happen. They had friends and relatives who had been hurt by the American Indians. So that fear was justified. But they also needed to treat the American Indians with respect and dignity. And a lot of times they didn't. They thought, oh, they're different from us, so we're better than them. Because the American Indians lived simply, they thought, oh, they're uncivilized, they're less than, they're not any good. We can treat them poorly, and it doesn't matter because they're not as good as us. We're the top. We know now that everybody is equal and differences are wonderful, and we need to celebrate the differences between different cultures, different groups of people, but they didn't realize that back then. So we had all of these issues, and it was very complex. The United States would force the American Indians into some treaties. into these agreements because they were bigger. They had more people, more power, more money. So they could say, the American Indians could say, no, this isn't a fair deal. I don't want to do this. We don't want to give up the land over here and be moved onto the small land. We don't want to have to do that. We don't want to give up our rights. And the United States sometimes said, too bad, too sad. You have to do this. And we're going to force you to do this. So the United States did not always live up to their commitments that it made in the treaties. They would break their treaties. Ladies, let's not write notes to each other. So the United States would break treaties. Sometimes, I'm sure the American Indians might have also, because they were trying to fight back, because they weren't being treated fairly. So it wasn't an easy time. American Indians didn't know who they could trust. They didn't know who would actually look out for their best interest. As westward expansion continued into the early 1800s, the U.S. government began turning its attention to the lands west of the Mississippi River. Where is the Mississippi River? Where does it start?
Lake Itasca.
Lake Itasca, here in Minnesota. I live in Coon Rapids, and it actually goes right through Coon Rapids. So think about where the Mississippi River is. Before, what we were just talking about was the land that's on the other side, Wisconsin, Illinois, and going towards the East Coast. Now they're talking about right here. Mississippi goes through Coon Rapids. That's real close to us. So they're talking about this land that's right here and the land going out. So Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, all of that land. Colin.
Pretty sure it goes to Brooklyn Park as well.
Does it? That makes sense because one side of the Coon Rapids Dam is in Coon Rapids and the other side's in Brooklyn Park. Yep. So in 1803, France sold the United States the rights to more than 900,000 acres of land west of the Mississippi River. This included land controlled by the Ojibwe and Dakota in what is now Minnesota. So did France own the land? Not really, because the Ojibwe and the Dakota lived on that land. They controlled the land, but France thought that they owned the land. So France was the one that had claimed it as theirs. They sold that territory to the United States. And so now the United States is saying, oh, now we own the land, but the Dakota and the Ojibwe live here. They're saying, well, what do you mean you own the land? This is our land. This is where we have lived for centuries. So now there's this conflict happening. Who actually owns the land and how do we live together on this land? So we're going to see a lot of conflict happening. We're going to stop with our reading for today right there. So I'm going to say goodbye to our friends at home. We hope that you are doing well.